dominance rather than foreign aid. Start of the debate on the countries why the Prime Minister delivers. Yeah.
Love your neighbors as you love yourself. But the question is everyone doing the same? Therefore, we from the South government believes that food aid is more of a foreign policy tool for dominance rather than for real aid. Before I move on to my two arguments, to my two positive materials today, let's take a look at few definitions from the side of government. From the side of government, food aid is a form of basic necessity given under certain circumstances, and that circumstances would be when a country is having a war, or when that particular country is in a big disaster, and when they can't afford to have, and when they have limited food on their own and they can't survive without any anymore. And what about dominance? Dominance is the influence from the recipient countries, that is the country that is giving the aid, to carry out dominance is the influence to the recipient countries, the one that will be receiving the aid, to carry out certain principles that the giving country wants. That in the context of our debate today is the developed country. And what about foreign policy too? We are in this context of the debate today, we are not talking about organizations such as OIC or the United Nations and whatnot, but rather we are talking about a country as a whole, and the countries that are involved here are the developed countries and the developing countries, or the non-developed and also the non-developed countries. And who is the one that will see and decide that whether this is a form of dominance or not? We tell you that there will be three stakeholders that will be deciding whether they are dominated or not. So first of all, it will be other countries that, or other superpowers that will see whether this is a form of domination or whether this is not a form of domination. The second stakeholder would be the neutral companies, that is the neutral countries that is the countries that is not involved in giving the food aid, and countries that is not involved in giving the food aid. And the third recipients we tell you would be the recipients of the food after the long time, whether after they receive it, upon receiving the food aid for a certain time, they will know whether the food that they have received, the food aid that they have been receiving, whether it's a genuine or something that is done, whether of the willingness of other countries, or something that is done to influence their thoughts. And yes, before I move on, Sarah.
Developed nations even want dominance over war-torn and famine-stricken.
Exactly. You see, the thing about developed countries is that they do not want their power to stay at one particular place only. What is their intention? They want their powers to go all over the world and to be known and to be known by the world. And by giving this food aid, their name would be all over the newspaper, and they will be the one that take glory by giving people the food aid. Now moving on to my two positive materials. Today I'll bring to you two positive materials: the nature of food aid and the ulterior motive that is not highlighted by the people. First of all, basic necessity. What is basic necessity? Food is one of them. And why food? Why food aid and not other forms of help? Because we all know that food is a form of necessity, and people cannot survive without it for long term. And under our government characterization, we already told you that we are talking about the context of during the wars and disaster. So when you are in a disaster, when you are at war, you are so desperate for food. Food will be the only thing that you will look for and that you will want. And therefore, we tell you that when another country will see this as an opportunity to dominate you. And as the country that are so desperate for food in times of disaster and in times of a war, you will enslave yourself or give yourself up without weighing the consequences that may happen. or may not happen in order to get that food, in order to survive for that particular time. Yes.
Before that, what kind of, give me an example of what kind of foreign policy domination are you talking about? Military?
It can come in that sense. For example, in the Gulf War in 1991, Iraq and Kuwait was having a war, and US came in. US came in to help. What happened after that? US asked Iraq to actually help them. US helped Iraq in order to gain access to their oil, and this is one of the foreign policy tool that may involve parts of, but of course I can't read the minds of all the countries that's helping. So of course certain countries have their own political agendas that we don't know about because it's so subjective. Secondly, move on to the Hobson choice. Hobson choice is when you give someone a choice, knowing that they have no choice but to take the choice that they are given at that particular time. For example, in this particular time, you know that people are in need of food, so they have got no choice. They either take it or they would die. And which one seems to be a more better options at that particular time? Of course, to take it. For example, even when you're hungry and someone would just give you 2 drumsticks, of course you will just take it without weighing whether you don't. And for example, in the case of natural disaster, where you know your plants are all destroyed and you know that you will have no food to survive in a few months to come, so you have no choice but to take whatever that is given to you. And of course, people at this particular time, they also value certain amount of trade. For example, they will succumb to whatever that they are given. And the government will see this as an opportunity because they know that you are in trouble and you need something from me right now. So they will see this as a form of opportunity to get whatever that they want from you maybe later on. And moving on to my second argument, ulterior motive that is not highlighted. You see, there are many ways other nations can influence other countries, and by giving food in time where another country is so desperate for it is one of the way. And for example, I've already told you about the Gulf War, which happened in 1991. Where US actually offered a military aid to Iraq only to gain access to their oil later on. And why is it that this thing is not highlighted in media? It's because the developed countries, they actually control the media. For example, it controls the thoughts of that particular country. For example, in Moscow time, right? Of course, Moscow will justify the actions of Russia. They won't justify the actions of other countries. So this is how they portray themselves as being the real and the genuine one. And the people like us, who do not know, and people who read the newspaper will think that is real and will buy into that policy. So what I brought to you today, I brought to you 2 arguments: nature of the food aid and the ulterior motive that is not highlighted by the media, and people do not know whether these countries are giving it out of their own will or due to other factors. With that, I'm proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for your speech. Now I'd like to invite the Leader of Opposition to do a speech.
Mr. Speaker, I find it very funny when Prime Minister said herself that she can't read the minds of Western leaders of Western countries when they give food aid. So it's really a concession that you can't prove that there's any kind of foreign policy domination, because you have never proven us examples or any kind of explanation on what kind of foreign policy do you mean. Do you mean militarily? Do you mean culturally? Do you mean changing the country's economic policies? We see zero explanation on their side. Hence, it's very difficult to really engage on what kind of paradigm that they're trying to propose in this debate. The only example that they give is the Gulf War. Mr. Speaker, the Gulf War is a military intervention, and we think that has nothing to do with food aid whatsoever, and hence has no relevance or bearing into today's debate whatsoever. And they have a lot to do in Deputy Prime Minister to clear this out. But the other thing they said is that, okay, developing countries do not have a choice. That is why they are coerced to accepting food aid from Western countries. We say this is not true, simply because there are extremely abundant amount of sources where you can get food aid. For example, NGOs like Mercy Malaysia and the Red Cross and the Salvation Army will be the first one who go to poverty-stricken countries and to war-torn countries to provide massive amounts of food aid. If not NGOs, there will be regional bodies like ASEAN and the African Union that will help out all these kind of poverty-stricken countries. But the more important contributor is the United Nations, where they have a UN World Food Programme, which is not political, which is neutral, that has tremendous amount of resources and technical expertise to distribute resources. So I don't understand why would developed countries like Haiti now of US dominance if there are so many other alternatives out there, and that's something they need to explain. You disagree?
Tell me when you can have more food, you will choose to reject the more food that you can have.
We think that the United Nations, in fact, provides more food, and it even provides a food which is unconditional at that is non-political. You more rather accept the food sources from the UN instead. We don't think that this is the thing that's happening in the world order today. You need to prove to us how, despite many other sources that we have in today's world, that have choices that are given to these developing countries, will they suddenly opt to a conditional offer by the United States or United Kingdom? Mr. Speaker, I want substantive today. I'll tell to you why Western countries in their context have natural checks and balances that prevent them from coercing foreign policy in food programs, especially on two levels. Firstly, the media spotlight and coverage. Mr. Speaker, we think it's extremely bad press if the media finds out that the US is saying to Haiti, we will only give you food aid if you allow us to enter your country to develop a military base, for example. We think that the reputation of Western countries is something that is at stake now. Considering the fact that New York Times and Al Jazeera have special segments and journalists that focus specifically on world hunger in developing countries, we think it would be extremely damaging if they found out that the United States or United Kingdom is putting a gun towards developing countries and saying that you should allow just because I can offer you food aid. Because food aid is something that is so fundamental to people's life. It's at the lowest form, the lowest base in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That is why it's very intuitive for people around the world to condemn such an offer by Western countries simply because food is something that is so necessary for the survival of humans. Because it's very time sensitive in nature. If the countries decide to deliberate and to discuss and to negotiate on the conditions that these Western countries want to offer, people will simply die off. That is why the media will come into play. Before that, yes.
Well, can you explain how the media is not biased and how the media is not dominated by these superpower countries already?
We think that there are many other alternative media, Al Jazeera, even CNN and BBC are neutral in that sense. But even if you do not have media, we think the citizens in that particular country will, through democratic cultures and structures, will not allow this to happen. Because it's simply inhumane to food aid to developing countries. We think that the people and the citizens within that country will condemn the government actions of offering food aid with a condition to people necessary. We think that there are natural checks and balances through the media, through even the debating in legislature, where opposition figures in Congress and Parliament can come out and say that this is something that we will not stand for, simply because food aid is an important source of nutrition, an important source of survival for many people in developing countries necessarily. We think that, Mr. Speaker, on my second point, how necessary the people should now gravitate towards the United Nations, which is neutral and non-political in nature when it comes to food aid. Simply because the organizational structure of the UN is non-political. Because we are talking about the World Food Programme, and it's similar to the World Health Organization. It's unlike the United Nations Security Council, where political decisions are infused in it, where you have the veto power by powerful nations. We think that the UN World Food Programme is professionally run by technocrats. We think even the leader of the World Food Programme is a PhD, is an academician. We think that there are also internal mechanisms of accountability within the United Nations itself, because the World Food Programme is helmed and it's overseen by the United Nations General Assembly, where people often debate about the distribution of food. So whenever there is a political kind of tag that's attached towards distribution of food, there will be natural condemnation and checks and balances. And that is why the United Nations is the best way for people to go into, to subscribe to, instead of Western liberal countries that essentially put draconian measures in it. Draconian measures where you do not know under their policy what is it they are standing for today. We think that there are also, for example, Mr. Speaker, instances of where we are gravitating towards a culture where the donation is very public-centric. So for example, in the Fill a Mug campaign, the public can necessarily contribute online to fill a mug of an African child, or the UNICEF Tap project, where if you leave your phone untapped and unpressed, necessarily you will help donate 1 cup of water to a starving African child. These are public kind of donations that tell to us today leverage of countries anymore in the donation cycle that we're going today. It has become a voluntarily public contract. Hence, there is no political elements that are attached to it. The UN manages this, and it can equally and equitably distribute it to people who are in need. Those developing countries do not need to rely on Western countries anymore. You need to prove that fact. But even if they rely on Western countries, we think that there are internal mechanisms in Western countries themselves that prevent them from going on this very dangerous line of contribution and aid. For all those reasons, we are proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for his speech. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to deliver the case of China.
Thank you.
Basically, it's like this. The developed nations here extend an olive branch, hoping that these underdeveloped nations or the nations in disaster take the olive branch and let it take root in their nation. That is how dominance occurs. And now I'll explain to you, since they need clarification on foreign policy tools, and this I will explain in a full analysis in my speech. 4 levels basically about how this is a foreign policy tool. First of all, about how these developed nations gain favor among these nations or among other nations in the world. Second, about influencing state policies of these underdeveloped nations. Thirdly, about interference in national sovereignty of the developing nations. And fourth, about how they influence and dominate economic policies in our world today. And all this I'll explain in full terms in my analysis and my studies material. But now moving on to the other rebuttal. Second other rebuttal about international organizations. We see that WeJet brought a lot of international organization examples, but please debate on the definition that we've given today. We have already explained that all this foreign policy tool is basically about a developed nation, a single nation, giving or extending dominance over the other nations. Why we believe that UN, in that sense, has no foreign policy tool here in this. But the issue here is with all the developed nations. I'm talking about whether it's enough or whether, like, example in Haiti, you know, where the UN sends teams and all this. We believe that there is insufficient aid as it is. Why? Because in Haiti itself, there were millions of people who required food aid, and we believe in that sense, United Nations did not have the sufficient amount of aid to give to Haiti and other nations if there was a natural disaster. In that sense, they would have to mobilize these developed nations, and these developed nations can extend on the issue of check and balance to coerce. Well, we have already explained to you that, in our POI that the media is biased. There is a form of biasness towards the media, towards long-term reliance on these developed nations and how they can extend their dominance as a whole, because there is a need for continuous supply of food. And we believe that in this situation, sometimes United Nations is unable to supply the continuous supply of this food aid, and we believe that is how developed nations extend their dominance. Now, going on to my substantive about dominance, finally, that will really explain everything you need to know. One, dominance in the form of gaining favor in the international community or the global society. In the current situation, we realize that there has conflict between the western side of the world and basically Russia in that sense. Well, it's basically like a repeat or repeat of like an imagery of the previous Cold War that we had. What happens is, in this situation, when a natural disaster arises, we believe that what US will do, or what the Western side will do, will try to gain political capital or political influence to gain the favor from this developing nation. What is the purpose of this dominance in the first place? It's denied. In the United Nations General Assembly, what happens is there are votes that's needed to be taken by the 193 nations, which either support the condemning of the Crimea incident or otherwise. And we see this as a main reason or an opportunity for the nations like US or even Russia to extend their olive branch and say, you know, why don't you take this for us so that we extend the support gain so that you will follow our policies, our international policies, and give support to us. We see that that is a big issue. Second, about dominance in the form of influencing state policies. Well, in a sense here, this dominance may not be good, may be good in that sense, but how is it influencing state policies? Basically, I give you an example of Myanmar. Like, basically about the issue of the military junta in the state. Well, it may be a form of betterment of society, but in that state itself, you see, basically it's what these developed nations think that these underdeveloped nations need denied. We believe that this is a form that how they change the state executive system by giving them, offering them food aid in a sense, by changing the way they think, and we see that this is a form of dominance. Now, third, dominance in accepting, extending interference in national sovereignty. Well, this creates an issue of dependency. When there's a food aid given in that sense, we believe that, you know, these developed nations want dependency on their nation so that whenever they need help, they go to them. Why is it so important in this form of dominance? Because it shows that their ability to provide continuous aid and provide dependence is something that is a form of glory to them and a form of dominance on the developing nations. Finally, the last form of dominance in economic policies. We believe that there is this positive influence that they want to extend, as in, I want to help you to higher the chances of better benefits through trade, international trade, like lessen tariffs and restrictions on opportunities for export and import. We believe that, you see, what happens here is like these developing nations have a lot of raw materials that is highly valuable and highly useful to these developed nations. And we see that this is a form of a dominance where they want to dominate the economic policies in the international market. So based on the four levels of what I gave you today, we believe that this house food aid is more of a foreign policy tool than of dominance rather than real aid. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for his speech. Now, to continue to give some side opposition, I can invite the yellow
Mr. Chair, according to their logic, if UN or US comes in to help the people in Crimea, to help the people in Haiti that suffered from things and now they need food aid, now everyone who has been helped will now vote for US in the UN General Assembly because we love them, because we're dominated by them. We reject that characterization. One question that I want to ask before I go into my substantive today: what dominance are they really talking about? They talk to you, finally, in second speaker, we have some resemblance of what they are trying to show today. They tell you gaining favor is a dominance. That when you give food aid and then you extend the olive branch, and now you show that you're a good person, you gain favor in the international community. We say gaining favor at best makes you portrayed in a good light by people, at best makes people amounts to dominance whatsoever. But secondly, they tell you food aid is used to influence national sovereignty and national policy, right? We think in this debate, when you're talking about status quo and you're proving something that is happening in status quo, you interest of their country. There are a few checks and balances. Firstly, if the requirement or your condition that you impose onto the recipient country is too high anyway, and they cannot comply to your conditions, then those countries are necessarily out of the debate, right? Because they cannot comply anyway, therefore they're not dominated. But let's look at what are the countries that we're really talking about? The countries that do accept your condition and comply with the conditions. Does complying with your condition amount to me being dominated by my donor country? We say no. In any case, we think it is at best an exchange or compliance to a condition. These exchanges happens anyway in a lot of situations. It is a trade-off. We think it's a transaction that in fact gives you mutual benefits. What are we talking about? In other situations, right, if I'm even not talking about food aid, you also have things that also requires the government to comply with certain conditions, like trade agreements, right? If Malaysia wants to trade with China, for example, I have to remove certain tariff barriers. I have to give them easier credit. I have to give them easier access to companies locally. We think that is the form of compliance that you have to give in order for you to gain a certain benefit. Does that mean Malaysia now is dominated by China? We say no.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, what we from the side of government get from side of the opposition is on how they tell us that exclusivity does not happen in our case, and check and balance for this domination to happen. But actually, in our point, we already tell you how this natural check and balance is flawed, but they do not seem to understand. So I will just explain it further in my clashes later. Today, I will present to you 3 clashes here. The first one is on this check and balance that was mentioned just now. Second one is on developed countries and NGOs that can provide this help, and the third one is on domination that were being argued, that they don't understand what domination that we were talking about throughout this debate. Okay, the first one on this natural check and balance that was mentioned, we already have proved to you how this medias that is the natural check and balance is really flawed, but they come out and tell us how there's BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera that is neutral. But we do not believe that is the case, because even this media is neutral in up to certain point. They still have this hierarchy in their media company that withhold them. They have these gatekeepers, they have these editors in the editorial board that can edit out whatever they are writing about. So that is how this media check and balance is already flawed, and they are biased in their nature itself. Okay, so when this media they succumb to certain pressures that come from their country, from their management or their own countries, like for example what my speaker told you just now, the Moscow Times, because they belong to Russia, so they will be more Russian biased in their reporting. That is how this natural check and balance has already failed, and it does not really reflect the real dominations that happen when this food aid is given. Okay, and then to my second clash here, it's on developed countries versus NGO. Okay, we already told you that this debate, this food aid is given to countries during time of war and disaster. And with that being stated, we have to assume that this amount of people that are affected is so high that NGO, yes, they can provide, but they cannot cover completely for them, and that is when only developed countries can provide enough for these people. Okay, so let's look at what NGOs really do. NGO doesn't really get fund, but they are fully based on donations by the public here. So even if they can help, it's just a very partial help that they can give, because they can't really give in all whatever that they have to this country who is stricken, because they have to prepare to help other countries that might be in the future. So we believe that under these circumstances, only these developed countries can really provide the complete food aid that is needed by all these countries who are war-torn or are struck by natural disaster. And yes, so in terms of exclusivity, it does happen in the long term, in time-wise, because NGOs such as Mercy and all these they cannot provide in long terms for these countries, but only developed countries with full resources, and they want to do that, they can do it. Okay, before that, any POI?
Are you seriously saying that the United Nations World Food Programme doesn't have capacity to provide food for a country like Haiti, and they have to depend on the US that have so many conditions?
Okay, we agree that UN can help these countries when they are having this problem, but we do not think that UN can help completely in covering up this. That is when all these developed countries can come in, and all these a lot of people will come in to give them help and support. But at the end of the day, the organization that can give the most help and in the very long term is the developed countries themselves, because they are only helping this. But for this UN and NGOs, they have to focus on every other countries that are stricken. But for these developed countries, they can only focus on these particular countries that they aim to have a dominance over. Okay, and then moving on to the third clash here, it's on domination. So we already my second speaker already tell you about what kind of domination we are talking about. The first one, gaining favor. The second one, influencing state policies. The third one, interference in national sovereignty. And the fourth one, in economic policies. So before that, I have a clarification to whatever the opposition has said just now, we do not say that the country will point a gun to a certain country to force them to take in this food aid. But what we are saying is, if you are already in a deep trouble, would you reject any aid that will be given to you? Naturally, you will just take it in, because we believe that whatever the NGOs that they mentioned provide will never be enough for any of these countries that are in troubles. Okay, so an example given by the second speaker just now about how this China and Malaysia is not being dominated by China, but when you have no choice, when you're already stricken by this either war or natural disaster, you have no choice, and then it will become a form of dominance of China to Malaysia. Yes.
If these countries need the food aid so much, should they reject the food aid because they don't want to be dominated?
This country that we are talking about, they are already at a very desperate conditions, because they are either war torn or they are having natural disaster, and that is why they cannot provide for themselves, and that is when all this help will come in to help them. So if when they are at this desperate state, that's what my first speaker have told you, it became you don't really have an option. You have to take it in, because if you don't take it, you will die. You will die of starvation, you will die of hunger. So how, even if it comes with so many conditions that it wasn't stated in the first place, what we from the side of government say is, this aid that is given by these developed countries they do not point a gun at you, and they do not really state all these prerequisites to you when they give it to you. But they give it to you, and when you take it already, then only they will tell you like what they want. Like they want a favor they want to gain favor over this, and they want to influence your policy. And when you have already taken in all this, it is too late for you to reject whatever it is, and that is when this dominance happens. And with that, we are very proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the government whip for a speech. Now I'd like to invite the opposition whip.
Mr. Speaker, if these ulterior motives are so intuitive, so subtle that we didn't realize it, I don't know how in the world it managed to change economical policies, how it managed to change passings and bills in parliament. We have no idea, because these countries must be really desperate, because they didn't realize this long progression that took place. We reject the characterization coming from the government bench that it has the capability to suddenly dominate a country just because you send a bag of rice. I have 3 issues for you today. Number 1, domination through the olive branch. Secondly, I'll talk to you about whether does food aid have political capacity to manipulate countries. And last but not least, I'll show you whether developed countries do pry on desperate, hunger-stricken nations to gain control. Let's look at the first issue, because that's the main contention coming, especially starting from the Deputy Speaker. Domination through the olive branch. The government told us that by accepting a bag of rice, by accepting food aid, it will suddenly lead to 3 different things. Infringement on state sovereignty, it will affect the economical policy, and also number 3, change state policies within Parliament. Mr. Speaker, analogically speaking, this olive branch is broken and separate to begin with. What do I mean? That means that there is no cohesion, that there is no binding power for countries now to comply with whatever their donor nation is telling them to do. But even that, if that was the case, we tell you that there are already checks and balances within society, how there is media, how there are other nations and other NGOs as well to check against whatever corruption that may take place. No, thank you. We think even in the local sphere in governments that parliament policies go through a 2/3 majority and many readings before it's been passed. Just because a foreigner provides some form of food aid, I don't think it has the capacity to suddenly change bills and to change economic policies in favor of them. But even if that was the case, we don't think there is much incentive for developed nations to even have that form of domination or to gain control over countries that are already war-torn or famine-stricken. We think it's extremely preposterous. Let's look at the second issue. Does food aid have any form of political capacity to manipulate nations? We tell you no on many fronts. Number one, Firstly, right, in the event of natural disasters or famines, we think countries are still able to filter through the best form of aid there is. How in the influx or through the publicization of all these disasters such as Haiti or even in Aceh, we believe that nations are able to sort out trustable sources that do not provide conditions. It's ridiculous to say that in the flood of that aid, that I would choose the one that would jeopardize my state security, that I would choose the one that would infringe my people and enslave them even further. We don't think states are that dumb, essentially. But secondly, right, no thank you on this idea, because we tell you that there is no binding power to coerce receiver nations into action. But if that was the case, that there are natural checks and balances, because Wajid told you explicitly in his speech about the power of media and how that acts as a buffer against any form of corruption or domination that you would have today. CNN, Fox News, whatever it is, there is a spectrum ideology to champion the calculus of these nations if there is truly some form of cultural domination per se. But there are also alternative forms of media, such as the case of social media in today's debate, because we need to realize that this is a tech-savvy age where people have free accessibility to information. We tell you thirdly as well that on the ground that local developing nations have their own form of media coverage, that if truly there was some form of domination, that the people will be able to voice out to their governments in order to act upon it in any case of that matter. But before that, yes, sir.
In check and balance and the social media, we believe that dominance here is already evident because the small nations are unable to condemn them on an international level, even if the community in their voice out their displeasure through social media, it does not amount to a concrete effort here.
There is a reason why that no form of domination takes place when nations are victimized by natural disasters or war. Because number one, you will have to realize that being at the center stage of the international media and news, countries do not have that incentive to push for that kind of control. Because if you do so, then you are internationally condemned. That means that your own policies and your own diplomacy is compromised on many fronts. It is for this reason that countries do not have any form of incentive to do that. But let's look at this further, Mr. Speaker, because we tell you that this form of aid is accumulated and collective. It means it's not just about the UN, it's about NGOs, it's about donor nations as well. If all 193 countries of the UN were to donate, then this form of domination cannot possibly proportionally trickle down to all the nations as well. What we're trying to tell you on our side is, if I were to donate now to some to perhaps the Haiti case or the tsunami in Aceh, it doesn't mean that I have some domination over that nation. We don't think this political leverage that they talked about ever really today's debate. Mr. Speaker, you need to realize that at the end, when large NGOs and the UN rights, there is no sole beneficiary because it's a collected measure for the betterment of these victimized nations. Rather, in the modern age, we think that there are other forms of modern neo-colonialism that countries would revert to if they really wanted to dominate, as Wajid already told you in his speech, such as in the case of sanctions or apartheid in 1972 in South Africa, or even the junta military that they talked about. If foreign aid truly had the capability to dominate, you wouldn't have seen the junta military reign for the last 30 years. But more than that, we think other forms of neo-colonialism would exist, such as indirect military coercion in the case of Russia and Crimea. The last issue for today, do developed nations pry on hunger-stricken, desperate nations to gain control? The government bench has been telling us today that there is some form of ulterior motive, some form of conspiracy theory that was never truly proven. We tell you that first world nations had no form of incentive to dominate these nations, but even if that characterization is true, then we ask you, why is Africa free today? Because Africa has been the acceptor and has been accepting aid from all over the world for the last 20 to 30 years. We think even your ideas of gaining favor do not hold in today's debate. That if the aid was truly genuine, we think that there's nothing wrong with these nations even accepting that aid per se. At the end of this debate, Mr. Speaker, you need to realize that this form of domination was never truly proven on the side of government. We told you as well how on the international arena we have natural check and balances such as media and other forms of donors and NGOs to stand by to ensure that aid is genuine and that the philosophy of aid directly helps the victims at hand. For that, we're proud to oppose.
Thank the opposition leader. I'd like to sound the case inside opposition invite the Vice.
Mr. Speaker, the burden on side government is to prove foreign policy dominance. And we believe that on side opposition, we have discharged our burden proving that they don't impose dominance. Firstly, because dominance can only happen if the source of aid is exclusive to Western countries. And we've proven you on many fronts that there are many bodies, like the NGOs, and even regional bodies, or the UN World Food Programme, that is stacked with food banks and storages and is able to disseminate food professionally and logistically wise. We think there are also programs where there is public source when in cases of emergency. So there's an accumulation of other alternative sources of world food, especially in cases of emergency, where the people of the world won't necessarily respond to that particular scenario. Hence, there is really no reason for a Haitians to naturally choose a US aid that attaches foreign policy and national sovereignty dominance. So they have never proven to us why it's exclusive to Western countries in the long run. Secondly, we say to you that domination can happen if you have proven to us that these developing countries are essentially shackled on all fronts. But you've never proven to us. You said that firstly, now US will appear in the good books of African countries, hence they will vote in the UN General Assembly. We don't think that being in the good books of a country necessarily means that there is a certain form of dominance. Just because the United States help us in the search of MH370 doesn't mean that when we are friends with them and we are getting charmier with them, doesn't mean there's a dominance of the United States on our policy. Secondly, they threw out very blatant terms like incursion of national sovereignty without any analysis on the process of it happening, any kind of precedents that are happening. And the only example they gave is the Gulf War, which is completely out of context here because it's a military intervention. They have never proven to us on any examples whatsoever. But thirdly, and this is where Deputy Leader Opposition provided extensive analysis, that just because you comply with certain conditions doesn't mean there's a domination in this sense. Just because you liberalize your trade policies where you yourself has mutual benefits, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a dominance on your part. And that's the best case scenario on their side that we have engaged, and you have never engaged on our side of the house on this issue. But the more important thing is this, that Western countries themselves, we do not think that they will blatantly offer conditions, because there are many natural checks and balances within Western countries themselves. In the US, where not only CNN, but there are alternative media like Al Jazeera that has become mainstream, where social media were happening, that they will tell the stories of the people on the ground, where even developing countries themselves, when they are coerced to accept food aid, they themselves will naturally voice out to the international community that they are being coerced in a certain way necessarily. We think there are many outlets to tell the world necessarily that this is a form of coercion, and that is why Western countries wouldn't risk their reputation or their good name in the world to do so. We also think that necessarily if citizens of the particular Western countries and the electorate and also opposition figures will form natural checks and balances to say that you should not have this inhumane policy where we are talking about the most basic form of survival of human food, where it's essential for us to live day by day. we do not think that the citizens of the US will be that inhumane to allow the United States government to essentially force the developing countries to accept food aid with conditions. For all those reasons, Mr. Speaker, we think they have now proven this policy. We think domination doesn't happen in many forms. But with all those reasons, we are proud to oppose.
People killing, people dying, children hurt and living crying. That left me questioning, where is the love? Ladies and gentlemen, today's motion is talking about the versus between dominance and real aid. We realize the main issue here is that clearly failed to prove that this food aid is real aid, sincere aid given out of love. They have failed to prove that. All they wanted to do was just to attack the issue of dominance, but they have failed to prove how is it real aid more. That is a failure from the opposition bench itself. Now, moving on to first the main clash of today's debate. We believe the main clash of today's debate was about dominance and whether it is a form of dominance or not. Well, the opposition brought up how it's condemned by other as the government has clearly proven to you, opposition here has missed the boat. Why? They have sides talking about how international organizations provide options. But when we have proven that when the options are insufficient, there's insufficient, when the supply, the aid is insufficient, they have to export from the superpowers. And then what happens? We have proven that it is a form of dominance in that sense. Secondly, about the issue of how it's condemned by other nations, we have already proven with POIs and also rebuttals that smaller nations here are unable to condemn these major nations. In that sense, there's already dominance happening where a lot of nations, by the sense, will not condemn these superpowers because they are already politically affiliated, and that's what we have brought to you today. So in that sense, there will be a form of dominance through food aid. And thirdly, we've also proven that even if you reject food aid because you do not want to accept the term of conditions, that it is also a form of dominance. Why? Because of this dominance, you can't receive the food aid. Basically, it's a form of dominance in that sense. We have explained the example of North Korea. Now, on the burdens of proof, what the government has tried to prove to you today was that dominance here exceeds the notion that food aid is real aid here. We have proven with the Hobson's choice during a natural disaster about being time sensitive and how it becomes highly difficult to think rationally and you have basically no options in that sense. And we have proven with the 4 levels of dominance. Example, like, we've proven again, they kept questioning us that is this a form of dominance? Now, let me just put it simply to you. Gaining favor is to dominate your vote. Isn't that dominance? Second, about influencing national parties, isn't that also dominance? And third, we have explained the trade. When you have no choice, especially during a natural disaster, and in the future you have to trade, isn't that also dominance? We have already proven that to you. Well, the opposition has only been able to prove what they wanted to prove by using examples of international organizations. Well, the question is, examples of dominance. Give us examples of dominance. But where are there examples of real aid? We question. Isn't that absolutely, something that is so surprising that you can question us? Please practice what you preach. Can you prove that is really in that sense? So, based on what I have said earlier, and just finally to end this, is Africa truly free of political influence? Is Africa truly free of any form of dominance? Thank you.
Thank you.